Helo pawb a croeso I webinar heno gyda Gwadd Manod Williams. Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar this evening with our guest Manod Williams. Ychydig o ddannau o gadw ti cyn I ni ddechrau, just a few bits of housekeeping before we begin. Bydd y cyflwyniad tua 40 munud o hyd ac yna cwestiynau. The presentation will be about 40 minutes long, followed by questions. Mae'ch camrau a'ch microphonau wedi diffodd. Your camera and microphones have been turned off. Mae'n croeso I chi ofyn unrhyw gwestiynau drwy gadael y cyflwyniad drwy defnyddio cwestiwn o ateb popi fyny a ganol gwaelod y sgrin. Please feel free to ask any questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A pop-up on the bottom centre of the screen. Mae'r webinar hwn yn cael ei gyfnoddi a bydd ei wefan I weld yn nes ymlaen. This webinar is being recorded and will be on the website to view later. Ar diwedd y webinar, y byddwch yn cael ei cyfrifio at ffurflen werthusu. Pe byddwch yn gallu ei gwblhau, byddem yn diolchgar iawn. Mae hyn yn ei helpu ni dysgu o bob gwenyma a casglu gwybodaeth am bynciau neu wasanaethau yr hoffech ei gweld yn y dyfodol. At the end of the webinar, you will be directed to an evaluation form. If you could complete, please, we would be very grateful. This helps us learn from each webinar and gather information on topics or services that you'd like to see in the future. Caiff ei cyflwyniad heddiw ei gyflwyno gan Manod Williams. Mae Manod Williams yn darllenydd mewn gweithio Da Byw yn Eibers Prifysgol Aberystwyth, sy'n dysgu myfyrwyr Cymraeg a Saesneg. Edrychwch ei PhD ar ymarferoldeb defnyddio Synwyryddion I fonityrau ymddygiad Da Byw a Borfa. Ynghyd â chydweithrwyd, mae ei brosiect diwethaf yn cynnwys gweithio'n agos gan darbarwyr addysg bellach I rhannu gwybodaeth am ddefnyddio technolegau Ffermio Da Byw manwl yn y sector Da Byw. Our presentation today will be delivered by Manod Williams. Manod Williams is a lecturer in livestock science at Eibers, Aberystwyth University, teaching both Welsh and English medium students. His PhD looked at the feasibility of using sensors to monitor the behaviour of livestock at pasture. Along with colleagues, his most recent project involves working closely with further education providers to share knowledge on the use of precision livestock farming techniques in the livestock sector. Byddem nawr yn trosglwyddo I Manod Williams. I'll now hand over to Manod Williams.
Well, yes, thank you very much, Llinos. Can I just double check that you can hear me there, Llinos?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll be talking tonight about what precision technologies and these tools can offer livestock farmers. And as Llinos quite rightly pointed out there, I am Manod Williams. I teach in Eibers, and if you do want to get in touch with me at the end of this webinar or sometime in the future, my email address is available on the screen there, so maw90@aber.ac.uk. Again, as Llinos mentioned there, part of the work we do as well as teaching our students, we try and do a little bit of outreach as well. And one of the projects I've been working along with my colleagues actually is the Precise Ag project. So if you do want to have a look at that, you can just have a Google search of that. And you'll see the sort of work we've been doing with trying to integrate sensors and PLF systems into livestock systems and trying to disseminate that information with further education colleges and also with farmers in those particular areas as well. So all of these slides now, they're going to be bilingual, but I'll be continuing obviously through the medium of English for the purpose of this presentation. Just to point out as well, I'm currently unable, at least, to see the questions because the PowerPoint slide is up in front of me. But I will be transitioning between a couple of videos and the slides. So I may be able to pick up on some of the questions if they do come through. However, I will try my best to answer any questions you might have at the end of the entire presentation. Okay, right then. So the objectives of this webinar this evening will be to discuss some of the factors, at least, that have led to the need for precision technologies. First of all, the importance of benchmarking as well. You know, we should be performance recording no matter what sort of livestock system we're operating in, and any other addition to that system then, be it a sensor system or a PLF technology as it's known, that'll only enrich the system if we actually know what's going on to begin with. So we'll look at benchmarking a little bit. We'll mainly be, in terms of the technologies, we'll mainly be looking at technologies available for the main ruminants that we're interested in, so cattle and sheep. And also, finally, I'll look at perhaps where this sort of technology might go in the future and what sort of technologies we might expect coming to the fore later on. Okay, so we need to begin with an incentive for all of this technology. So what are the current pressures facing the livestock industry? Let's just have a little refresher of some of these. So some of them, I mean, lots of these different pressures and focal points are actually relevant to the entire livestock sector. So some of the main ones are things like sustainability. And in fact, you could probably think of that as a pressure on individual livestock systems, but also as an entire industry as well. So we want to be as sustainable as possible in the context of resource use and the longevity of our systems. We're also interested in things like climate. The livestock sector in particular is getting a lot of pressure now in terms of climate, but actually there's a lot of research going in to try and mitigate some of these issues as well. So that's another factor to consider in terms of longevity and why we might consider sensor systems to try and help some of these issues. Things like antibiotic resistance as well, and how that might feed into the human supply chain, the human food chain as well. Again, that's something else that we're trying to face, as well as other problems like the use of anthelmintics and perhaps the overuse in some cases. And we're already seeing some of the issues cropping up because of the resistance we're seeing in some of these parasites on farm. So, you know, those are just some, it's not an exhaustive list of some of the pressures that are relevant to the sector as a whole, but there's also, on the other half of this slide as well, pressures unique to individual farming systems. And again, there's a lot of cross-pollination between the two halves of this slide, really. So we need to improve, as practitioners, we need to improve production efficiency, perhaps, and that can be pinpointed down to anything really within that system. Perhaps it might be the amount of lambs you produce per year. It might be daily live weight gain with cattle. It might be feed intake and feed use efficiency and these sorts of things. And you can measure them as output per hectare or individual animal and that sort of thing. Things like disease management as well, so it could be the amount of mastitis cases you might get from your herd or your flock, which could lead into the number of culls you have at the end of the year, the amount of lameness you might get. How can we detect these issues and diseases earlier so that we can perhaps treat these animals quicker in order to keep those animals producing over the course of their lifetimes, perhaps. And something else like feed budgeting might be something. So you might be going out with a plate meter and you might be measuring your grass and getting a good idea of how much of that grass is being utilized. But the question is, are there things out there as well that we can use to actually push that a little bit further? Well, there may well be, and we'll try and explore some of these as we go through these slides. So the first thing I wanted to mention was benchmarking. So as it says at the bottom of the slide, we must measure in order to make changes. There's no point just estimating by way of just guessing how we perform this year. We should be taking note of these, and I'm sure we all do. But things that we can do now currently, just with a notepad and pen, would be things like recording the amount of mortality we have, maybe the number of lambs that are born dead, perhaps, or the amount of lambs that survive up to the point of weaning. We could be looking at things like growth rates by weighing our animals regularly. The number of days to weaning, when that animal actually is removed from the mother, how much weight has it gained in that period of time, and how much weight perhaps will it gain thereafter. We could look at things like milk yield, or the amount of grass we actually grow and utilize. How much disease do we get, and how much of that can be reduced. Again, some of the points that I mentioned on the previous slide, things like how many offspring are we rearing per individual? What is our lambing percentage, for example? Are we getting one calf per cow per year in a beef system? And again, how are we using our resources, and how does all of this as well feed into the costs and the output from the systems? But, you know, these are gold standard stuff really, and things we should all be doing. So we can do that now without any additional help into the system. So what can the concept of PLF perhaps add? What value can it add? And what I mean by PLF, if you're not already aware, it's Precision Livestock Farming, and you may well have heard of this concept over and over again. But hopefully what I'm going to do tonight is try and flesh out some of these things that are being used in the context of PLF. Now, On the right-hand side of the slide there, you'll see my attempt at a translation of PLF, which is HMGDB, or Hwsmonaeth manwl-gywir Da Byw. I'm not sure if that's actually a published translation at the moment, but we'll go with that for now anyway. So what can PLF do to help sort of supplement the benchmarking that we're already doing? Well, at the moment, we can do things like recording the amount of time our animals actually spend feeding, for example, and we'll look at some of these things later on. We can look at things like lying time in our animals, and a lot of that work has primarily been done in cattle, as has many of the other things we'll look at this evening. But lying time, again, is another good proxy for performance and how those animals might actually respond to a particular treatment, maybe. There's things like temperature regulation, and we already see sort of, particularly in intensively housed animals like broilers, maybe layers, and pig production systems, where those animals are kept intensively housed for a long period of time. We can actually do things like regulate the temperature simply from your phone app, for example. But, you know, there may well be examples in future where we may be able to do things like that with other sorts of systems, and perhaps ruminant systems. Now, perhaps one of the most well-recognized items of PLF, if you like, is in managing fertility. So we've seen this coming over the last few decades to the fore, really, in dairy-based systems, and you know, the use of leg-mounted sensors in particular to look at step count and things like that when cows come into heat. And we'll have a look at how that has supported some farms in a minute. And also, we're doing some of this work in IBRS currently as well, is looking at actually at the spatial location of animals in relation to where they're grazing, for example, and what sort of risk that might pose to those animals. Are they grazing wetter areas? Are they grazing drier areas? And what sort of implications might that have in terms of parasite risk? Just going back to the top of my list, the feed intake I've got there is the first bullet point. At the moment, feed intake or estimating feed intake is very, very difficult to do. And I'll try and touch upon that near the end of the presentation, where I'll talk about some of the work, the research work that's going into trying to estimate feed intake with cows. And then disease diagnosis as well, again, looking at behaviors as proxies for changes in behavior, which may be related to disease, that is. So I'll try and integrate some of that in as well. So those are some of the things that we can do and almost do with PLF technology so far. So let's define some of these technologies to begin with. And I like to split these PLF or precision technologies into two separate groups. You've got animal-based sensors, and I know that you've had a webinar that has actually looked at one of these on-animal sensors to predict calving, and I've actually got a demo of that as well. But the on-animal-based sensors include things, sensors for detecting oestrus. And again, if you look at the image at the bottom of the slide there where I've got a cow, one of the main ways of detecting oestrus is actually looking at step count, and you'll probably be well aware of that if you keep dairy cattle in particular. And that's usually using sort of a leg-mounted pedometer. Sometimes an accelerometer is used as well. So EID as well is coming to the fore, particularly with sheep now, and we're seeing that being used with cattle systems and how EID can be coupled with other systems to actually enrich the data capture and management of those animals. We can actually use sensors as well to measure rumination. So if cattle are feeding, they should also be ruminating or chewing their cud, and we can measure the amount of time they spend doing that. And of course, that relates then to the amount of milk production possibly, or even the amount of meat they might put on as well. Disease detection, I've talked about a little bit, and again, usually it's behavioral cues that we're using at this point in time anyway to predict disease or to detect disease. And again, we'll look at that later on at the end of this session. Things like temperature tracking as well is being used at the moment, things like using rumen boluses. We can also use other sensors, perhaps in-ear sensors as well. Again, there's a lot of work going on in the background to try and optimize these things. And I've also talked about things like feeding, calving sensors, and also rumen pH, which again is looking at the animal, not at an individual level really, but more at a herd level with pH and temperature. Then you've got the off-animal sensors, and again, these can come within the PLF domain as well, if you like. So simple things like weighing scales that are integrated into perhaps into parlour exits, or perhaps somewhere else in your animal handling system. Body condition scoring is something that we need to do and is done throughout the industry with sheep and cattle. And of course, it's an excellent proxy for performance. And again, there are systems available now where you can automatically measure that using some camera-based systems. And again, I'll try and have a look at those with you before we finish too. Gait analysis, or analysing the movement of animals, is more specifically in looking at anomalies that might be related to the hoof or the leg. Lots of practitioners will be measuring the gait of animals, obviously by eye, and again, that's a subjective technique, but there are systems being developed now where those gait attributes can be measured actually automatically. Milk electrical conductivity as well for detecting mastitis, and there's other sorts of things as well which can be included in this PLF, with things like sorting gaits which are attached to EID and that sort of thing. And even things like facial recognition, believe it or not, are being developed to look for pain in the faces of our livestock. I skipped over eDNA there. That's something that we're actually doing in IBERS at the moment. Some of my colleagues are doing some good work with environmental DNA and looking again at whether or not the DNA of particular parasite vectors are actually present in a particular area of the landscape, so that we can manage the risk of parasites to our animals, and actually with the objective then of reducing the amount of drugs and anthelmintics needed for those animals. So those are the two types, if you like, of PLF systems: on animal and off animal sensors. So the first thing I want to do is just go through looking at sheep, actually. So PLF in the context of sheep and what is available currently to manage flocks. So the bread and butter really of any PLF system is actually knowing which animal you're measuring. So EID, believe it or not, is actually fundamental to some of the PLF systems that we're going to be looking at this evening. And I'll hopefully show you a video now on the next slide where EID can be used to actually automatically sort and draft animals and potentially weigh them as well. There are lots of different types of systems available, and of course it's all about making sure that you perhaps invest in a system which is going to give you a return on that investment, of course. And what I want to do now actually is just give you an idea of the possibilities of using EID, particularly with sheep, of course, with some drafting and drenching systems here. So what I'm going to do now is stop sharing my screen quickly so that I can just return back to the video I want to show you. So if I go to here, share that. Hopefully now what you should be able to see is a sheep handling system. And I'm just going to show you about a minute of this video. And again, you've got the link there, so you can go to this video in your own time if you so wish. Okay, so that was the key part really I wanted to show you as part of this video, and you can see how this sort of system could be used possibly to actually help manage your sheep, particularly if you're running large flocks, for example. So there are small adjustments here that can be made depending on the size of the sheep, and obviously you want to optimize where those sensors are in order that the clamp actually grabs the animal at the right location. So, you know, there are things that you need to optimize with some of these systems, but you can see possibly how this could be used to help manage a flock of sheep. And obviously all that data then, the weigh data, as well as shedding the animal, you're actually capturing some of that information as well. And of course, while the animal is in there, you could in fact undertake other things, perhaps like drenching or dagging those animals as well. The other one I wanted to show you, if I just stop sharing that there now, is this one, which actually is looking at using a drenching gun, but coupling the weight information of the animal in order to calibrate the gun automatically. So hopefully you should be able to see now an example. Again, it's by the company Tapari, and just a note, I'm not representing any companies here. But this is an example with cattle. It's actually a battery-operated drenching gun. Rather than depress the trigger entirely with your finger, what you're doing is just touching it gently, and then the whole thing just sort of delivers a dose automatically. But I think really where this is kind of at the fore really is actually being able to automatically weigh the animal, which might be a little bit laborious sometimes, and then to automatically calibrate that drenching gun then to give the animal the correct dose. So I'll try and show this.
Saving you time in the yards. The Tipari Revolution Smart Powered model is part of an integrated animal management system. The Tipari scale auto-calculates the animal dose and delivers it to the gun via Wi-Fi, which then automatically adjusts the dosage. This vital animal health information, along with weight records, can then be downloaded to your phone and emailed back to your office for further analysis and recording. The most noticeable feature on both models is that they're light and fit easily into your hand. This significantly reduces hand stress, meaning...
Okay, again, just to give you a quick example really of what is possible with some of these systems. And again, I think where that is going to be helpful, or something similar to that actually, is with things like anthelmintic resistance. So what I want to do now is go back to the PowerPoint. So you should be able to see a screen, the original screen where we left off there. So there's a couple of examples there with sheep management in terms of how PLF might be able to assist there. In the background to all this, you know, there's a little bit of research work going in to try and back some of these technologies up, or indeed to try and evaluate them. And this is just one example here of a paper which was published in 2018 actually, where they looked at some of the factors that might have been influencing or do influence farmers to either adopt or perhaps not to adopt a particular type of PLF system. So this was a questionnaire-based study which was done in England and Wales, and they sent out something like 2,000 questionnaires, and they got a response rate of about 22%. And they wanted to know, you know, why would farmers want to adopt something? Do those that adopt other things as well, other technologies? And perhaps what are putting farmers off from adopting some of these technologies? And again, you can go to that paper, it's an open access paper, you can have a read of that entire paper and look at the results themselves. What I've done here is I've just pulled some of the main points out. So adopters found it practical and useful, so they were looking at EID in particular here, and actually the use of EID in similar circumstances to what you saw in those videos there, so for automatic shedding and that sort of thing. So adopters found it practical and useful. Those intending to intensify were the ones that were most likely to adopt, and there was some negativity from some of those who participated. For example, some of them thought it was just government pressure that wanted, were trying to push farmers, in other words, to try and adopt some of these technologies. And interestingly, actually, some of those farmers that had adopted tended to have lower flock lameness. But the question is, was it the kit itself that led to lower flock lameness? Or in fact, you know, were those farmers more proactive in the beginning before they adopted the technology? And those are questions, again, that we can explore in the future. So that's one example there. Here's another example of some work which was done up in Scotland. In this work, what they did was they wanted to assess whether, again, in more of a quantitative manner, really, they wanted to assess whether automatic weighing, shedding, and identification of animals, sheep, of course, actually provided a benefit to the farming system. So they had 900 ewes, I think 600 of them were Scottish blackface, 300 of them were sheens, and they split the flock in two and equal proportions of breeds as well. And they managed one flock as a conventional system. In other words, they were managing them at flock level and not at individual level. And the other half of the flock then was measured as the PLF flock, as they called it. And they used EID, they used automatic shedding and weighing, and as well how that fed into the drenching system as well. And again, just some of the key points here, they found no difference in the performance, in other words, the growth or milk production of those those animals. But the amount of lambs needing anthelmintic, actually, because they were weighing and taking more information on board about these animals, dropped by 40%. The anthelmintic used actually dropped by almost by half. The total labour requirement dropped by more than a third. And the average net margin across 3 years for every ewe in the PLF system was plus £3 a ewe over the conventional system. So just to give you an idea of some of the quantitative information coming out of the research work going on in the background to try and justify, some of the uptake of these systems. Okay, so that's sheep, and I'll freely admit actually that a lot of the work that's been ongoing in the the PLF domain, as we call it, has actually been undertaken in cattle, especially over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. So what I'm going to do now is have a walk through some of the technologies available, and you can rate them for yourselves really for cattle. So there's a heck of a lot of sensors that are being used, and again, these are mainly on-animal sensors that I'm going to be talking about here now. I've already mentioned the use of the pedometer in the use of heat detection for cattle, mainly in the dairy industry, and that's really revolutionized really how we go about managing the fertility of our cows, and also to give us more information about those animals too. Another sensor which is being used quite frequently now, as accelerated in its growth, is actually the accelerometer. These are sensors that measure movement in 3 different planes. So it can give you information forward, side, and also in the 3-dimensional plane as well. And the rumen bolus as well that I'm just picking up on there. Now, if I just begin with the accelerometer there, because it's one of the more novel ones that I haven't talked about yet. The accelerometer actually has its derivative, if you like. It's actually been well used in other species. So I've got a couple of examples of images there that I've taken from other papers, other journal articles, actually, that they've used to look at the behavior of anteaters, chipmunks, meerkats, and a whole host of other animals, particularly endangered species, because these sensors can actually give us a lot of information on what these animals are doing. And if you couple it with other sensors, it can tell you where that animal is as well. So it's got it's very, very promising, very excellent, perhaps, in species continuity. Now, they're also finding their way into the livestock sector. And as I've said, the cattle industry, really, we're seeing a lot of these sensors being developed now. So I've got an image at the bottom right corner of the screen there of a couple of cows with a collar on, and some of you might be familiar, if you're dairy farmers perhaps, with sensor systems like Moo Monitor. I'm not trying to call any companies out here now, but Moo Monitor, for example, is a company who have got this integrated system with a neck-mounted sensor on the neck, which is measuring head angle, rumination and things like that, and relaying that information then back to a central system. You've got the pedometer and the accelerometer as well, doing similar things for heat detection and fertility management as well for lots of these systems. Again, I've got a website there if you do want to have a visit. AFI Milk there, again, not promoting anything, but just out of interest if you want to have more information on how these sensors are being used with cattle. So some of these sensors here now are going to form the bread and butter, if you like, of how what I'm going to talk about as we move forward here now. So in terms of oestrus detection or heat detection, as we like to call it, the crayon technique where we put tail paint or KMAR plates on the tail end of cows now, that's being used as an excellent supplement to some of these sensors that are being applied to animals. So the pedometer is being used to measure step count. So what we tend to see is activity increasing significantly when an animal is about to come into heat or she's about to ovulate. So that can give us really good information on the best time to inseminate those cows. If you look at the literature for these sorts of systems, the pedometer one there, you can see they've usually, in the literature, they've got an accuracy of between the mid-60s to the high 70s to 80s. Again, that's just a compilation of about 6 or 7 research papers that I found there, just to give you an idea. So it won't completely replace good stock management. I think that's one of the key points here. We've still got to do our odd 20-minute check here and there. Collar-mounted sensors now as well are available, again, to look at activity, and again, step count, lying time, rumination time. These are all things that these collar-mounted sensors now can actually identify. And again, you've got accuracy values there ranging for the different behaviors that those sensor systems are actually trying to identify. One of the issues really with dairy systems in particular is actually 20% or thereabouts of these cows actually won't exhibit heat behaviour at all. So you're almost starting on the back leg anyway with some of these. So we've still got to look for these animals and maybe ask the question, why are those animals not exhibiting changes in behaviour which can be identified by stock people? And there are other things and other ways that we can actually identify heat as well. I've got them at the list at the bottom of the slide there. Things like milk temperature directly from the animal, milk yield in dairy cows, and you can also combine these measures as well. I don't think any of those measures at the bottom of the slide there can be used in and of themselves to detect heat or oestrus, but actually if you did combine them, you could find some interesting patterns happening there, but that's more from a research perspective really. Of course, there are automatic milking systems now that are detecting progesterone levels. And of course, if progesterone is high beyond the point perhaps where you'd expect the cow to come back into cyclicity, then that could be an indicator of pregnancy in cows. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to do that. Perhaps the pedometer is the gold standard PLF way of doing it. So here's just an example really of some data demonstrating what happens when an animal comes into heat. So on the bottom of that graph there, you've got the number of days, if you like, before the animal was observed in heat or showing signs of behavioural oestrus. So you've got 7 days before up to the point of oestrus, and you can see her step counts there are demonstrated by the grey bars, and you can see that, you know, the day of heat, you can see it just absolutely skyrockets. So with the majority of the cows, really, it is a very, very good indicator that those animals are probably coming into heat. So, but that again is an important message. You know, any system that is put out there needs to be able to relay the information in a manner which farmers can make direct decisions from. So interfaces like this, which tell the farmer, for example, when to inseminate, is also important. Farmers aren't really interested. We're not really interested, I should say, in how many steps the cows took today. We're actually interested in what do I need to do with all this information, and that's a key issue. I know you've already had a webinar looking at calving. Here's one example. I won't go to the video now because I'm sure you're all very much aware of it. You can go to Mukol's website if you like and have a look at that. Again, this is a sensor integrated into a hard case, obviously, and it's an accelerometer which is looking at three-dimensional movement again, particularly with movement around the point of calving. So you've got a contract in place, and the sensor then relays a text message to the user to alert them, usually within a couple of hours before calving. And I remember giving this, just demonstrating this sensor system to a group of students last year. And one of the students, who was actually a dairy farmer, piped up and said, well, why would I want to be woken up 2 hours before calving in the middle of the night? Well, I thought, well, that's a really good point, but it's better than being woken up every hour to go and check that animal. So, you know, there are benefits to these things, but again, we need to take it into the context of practicality every time. But this is one example of a sensor which, as far as I know at least, is providing some good success for farmers. It might not be the answer for large herds, but it may well be in future. And again, if you're interested in looking at the background of, you know, the research that's actually going on to try and evaluate some of these systems, I've put just the front cover of the journal there, if you like, of a good review paper, if you want to have a read of it. Again, another open access paper, methods and on-farm devices to predict calving time in cattle. So that actually goes through many of the methods that can be used in the context of PLF to actually identify calving. So things you can do are obviously look at hormone concentrations, and some of these might increase or decrease before calving. Tail sensors I've already mentioned there, and again, what the sensor's looking for are raises in the tail, or more movement than would be seen usually in the hours preceding calving. Temperature sensors, again, is something that has been researched and can be used. And the key thing about all of these is that they're not invasive. Some of the earlier techniques that were coming out in terms of predicting calving were actually quite invasive, where something was pushed into the vagina of the animal, and of course it was the physical expulsion of of that implement then that was actually alerting the farmer of calving. But of course, how effective these things are with difficult calvings, etc., who knows? The jury's still out there, and the research still needs to be done. So again, not a complete answer, perhaps. Again, we still have to be good managers in all aspects of these systems. Just to point out the data at the bottom there, I've got a few colourful lines at the bottom there. That's actually some work, some data that was collected by a master student of mine, where we were placing, again, accelerometers on the tails of cows, just to look to see what the response was when the tail was going up and down. And you can see there, 2 of the 3 axes at least were actually picking up tail rising quite nicely. You can see the red one and the blue one rising quite nicely there. And those are actually periods where the cow is actually urinating. So you can see the tail lifts up quite quickly and then decreases quite at a slower rate. So could we be using these things to measure waste output in future from cows as well? So that's something else that actually may come to the fore in the future. Again, here's another one for cows, looking at automatic body condition scoring in this case. So, condition scoring, again, is another important attribute and a measure we should be taking. And this is looking at doing that automatically using an automatic camera-based system. So what I want to do again quickly is just stop the sharing here, and I'll go to the video that I want to show you. So bear with me one moment. Okay, so again, this is a camera system placed on the exit of a parlour, and it's taking images of the top of the cow, and it's scoring the cow in a similar way as to the manual scoring system on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being very thin, 5 being very... Okay, and we'll stop it there. But you can see, how practically this sort of thing could be used to reduce the amount of labour, reduce the amount of subjectivity as well. But you can see perhaps as well where you could have anomalies creeping in. So, for example, what happens when those cows are queuing up perhaps in the area where the camera is situated? These are things that we still need to optimise, and we need to explore, obviously, if that camera system itself can actually deal with that sort of issue. But again, it's going on. It's going on the physical attributes that we measure normally, like the hooks, the pins, the transverse processes, and those sorts of things. So again, going back to the core bread and butter of body condition scoring cows. So that was the final element of PLF I wanted to show you. Again, I've put a paper there in case you want to have a go and have a look at the raw data and the results of these sorts of experiments. Development of automatic condition scoring using a low-cost 3-dimensional kinetic camera. Now, that's not the only one. There are a number of researchers out there now working on these sorts of things, not just for dairy, actually. For example, for counting the number of poultry in a shed, the number of sheep that exit from a race, etc., so that you don't have to keep count, and those sorts of things. So finally, what I want to draw upon here is how can we enrich benchmarking? And I've got an example here from the context of cows again. So doing cow comfort assessments manually, and also by enriching it with some information from a PLF type of system or from a sensor system. So to assess cow comfort, we can do things like, on a daily basis, things like condition scoring. We can do that perhaps once a week or once a fortnight, or perhaps at a greater interval. We can look at things like mobility score as well, manually. We can score our cows on a level of 0 to 3, or whatever score you want to use, to see how many hoof lesions we have, or issues where cows may need treatment. We can also look at other precursors to discomfort, things like hock lesions, knee lesions, neck scores. I don't need to educate you in that sort of thing. You're already aware of these things. But they directly relate to production and performance. So, for example, the longer we can have dairy cows lying down for, then the more efficient they become then in converting that forage or that feed into milk. So the cows need to be comfortable. So we can take those daily records, and we can even look at things like the number of cows eating or ruminating, or the number of cows lying down when they're not eating. So is that number greater than 75%? Or when the cows are eating, are more than 80% of those cows actually eating? What are they doing? Are they just standing in the feed fence trying to get to the feed rail? These are all things that we can measure on a daily basis and actually apply changes to the system to make it more efficient. But there are other things we can do as well. And one of the things that's been well researched over the last 10 years is things like lying time in dairy cows in particular. Again, this is an area perhaps where beef farmers or beef systems need a little bit more research in. We're seeing very little research going into that sector, and it's a shame because we should really, really be trying to improve productivity in those sectors as well. But in the dairy sector in particular, lying time has been very, very well studied. And there is an example of one of my undergraduate dissertation students there putting an accelerometer onto the leg of a cow to get an estimate of how many cows are lying in our farm down at Trowscoed, the university farm, and also how long are they lying down for. So you can take a sample of 30 cows from every 100, and 30 cows is usually enough to give you an idea of the lying time and the comfort of those animals. So we can do that, and we can couple that information then with other things like lesion scores and mobility scores. And if it turns out that cows are only lying down for maybe 7 hours a day in your cubicles, then there might be something that we can do to that system to improve it. Maybe the cubicles need improving, maybe they need widening, maybe the brisket board is too far forward or too far towards the curb. Maybe we need more bedding material in there, or we just need to improve the comfort in another way. Maybe the feed rail, for example, is too low. These are all things that small changes, really, and small assessments we can actually make in order to make marginal gains, if you like. And again, here's another bit of research published in 2015, an assessment tool to help producers improve cow comfort on their farms. And that's a tool which accounts for all those you see in front of you there, so mobility, lesion, and lying time, again, and how these all relate to cow comfort. And it's quite well documented now that these attributes actually feed into performance at quite a high level. So where do we go next with some of these systems? So I've given you a brief introduction there to what is available and some of the pros and cons of some of these things. And I'm sure you can come up with some of the pros and cons yourselves as well. But where will this go next? Where does the research really need to go? So I mentioned right at the start that feed consumption is really an issue in the research area now that we're trying to tap into. It'd be fantastic at an individual animal level if we could tell how much that animal has eaten during that 24-hour period. And if she's only eaten perhaps, I don't know, 50% of what you expected her to eat, then what is going on? Currently, the sort of systems that are out there can give us information on the length of time they have been feeding for with a relatively high level of accuracy, using some of the sensors that we've already talked about there. But again, the question is, how can we actually quantify feed intake? Well, actually, feeding behavior is very, very complex, and trying to identify when an animal chews and swallows is actually very difficult. But there's a group in Belgium at the moment who are developing the sensor or the system known as RumiWatch. I've got it there at the bottom right-hand corner. And what that has got is an accelerometer located on a head halter on the side of the cheek to measure where the animal's head is. And then you've got a noseband pressure sensor there as well to actually try and identify chews and bites and chew bites and swallowing and that sort of thing. So it's a highly complex process, and perhaps in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, you might see commercially available products coming out there where we can actually estimate feed intake. But at the moment, not quite there yet, at least from the research perspective, but it would be great to get that information. Just tapping again into something that I mentioned at the start as part of the Precise Ag project, where we're looking at the spatial behaviour and of course how that changes over time of sheep in this context, and how that can feed into anthelmintic use. So, using GPS perhaps for location, as well as an accelerometer to identify feeding time and that sort of thing is something that's definitely coming to the fore now. And actually, how can we identify diseases as well? And as I mentioned at the start, behaviour is probably one of the best proxies for identifying disease and identifying it as early as possible. And at the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, I've got a really interesting piece of data there, really, which was published in 2008, so quite a while ago now, but it really kicked off this idea of, good gosh, can we use behaviour to actually identify disease? So what this was done in Scotland. It's an experiment where they had dairy cows in a feed alley, in a cubicle-based system, and each cow was allocated a bin to feed from, and each cow got to know then what bin that animal had been allocated to. And what they found was, if you just look at the top 3 panels there, A, B, and C, what they actually found was the overall feed intake of cows that were getting lame didn't really change that much, or didn't change significantly over time. So what we've got here is the days relative to the diagnosis of fowl of the foot in a dairy cow, this was. So this is 40 days before diagnosis, and this is day of diagnosis by the herdsman, and this is 40 days after. So we don't really see much change in feed intake, kilograms of fresh matter per day. So if you were only looking at feed intake, you might think, if you hadn't identified that cow as being lame anyway, you might think, well, feed intake actually isn't giving me much information. But when you look at feeding time in the middle there, so the amount of time she spent at the feed bin, you can see that it really shows this massive curve here where the cow starts to feed for a reduced period of time, perhaps up to 20 days before the visual diagnosis of a disease, in this case, as I say, lameness. And when you look at panel C there, the feeding rate of that cow actually went the inverse. So she was spending less time at the feed bucket, but she was actually, her feed rate was actually going quicker and quicker. So she was obviously in some sort of pain, and by the time it got to the day of diagnosis, that pain then was visual. And it's usually at that point, a lot of the damage has been done, and it's more about recovery work then for loss of milk perhaps or growth, rather than, you know, trying to rectify something before it gets to a major state, basically. So that work, in fact, was quite a milestone in realizing actually we can use sensors as a proxy for disease diagnosis. Now, obviously, feed bins are not very practical. So the question is, can we do that using individual and sensors which are as cheap as possible as well for farmers to use on a daily basis? Okay, I was going to mention a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in IBER. So here's some of that work. So looking at the identification of calf health issues, again, using behaviours as proxies. Again, looking at grazing behaviour, I've already mentioned that as well, and some of the eDNA work. Here are some of the publications that have come out of some of these projects at the bottom here. You can go to these and have a read of them. But as I say, if you just Google Precise Ag and IBER's Aberystwyth, you'll get a lot more information about some of that. And I'm happy to discuss these things as well over email. So, you know, as a final take-home message, and I'm sure you're already aware anyway, PLF sensors won't replace issues that are already there. They'll help us as practitioners to help solve some of these issues and perhaps even enrich the management interface. But they won't replace poor stockmanship, and they certainly won't replace farmers and other skilled workers. And in some cases, they're already making changes, and we've already said things like oestrus detection already well established, and we may well see some of these things feeding into future systems, particularly when it comes to things like enriching consumers with information. So consumers perhaps will be able to make choices on the type of animal, perhaps how long that animal was reared for, was it reared in a welfare-friendly way, and that sort of thing, how much pasture time did it get, etc., etc. So that's all data which in future may well feed in to the entire supply chain. So yeah, to conclude, PLF technologies can offer a deeper insight into key drivers of performance, and there's a heck of a lot of work going in the background to try and make sure these systems are commercially robust and sound, and I've pointed you towards some of those key papers there that you can have a look at. But as I mentioned as well earlier on, that these systems absolutely need to be practical and easy to use, and that information gathered needs to be converted into usable information for farmers on a daily basis. Another issue, of course, is that if you invest into an individual system, and then later on down the line you want to invest into another type of system, will those systems talk to each other? And that interface, again, is something which really needs to be looked at in a little bit more detail. And as I've already mentioned, many systems don't talk to each other. The information needs to be practical, and perhaps in future it might have importance in the entire supply chain, as we're seeing perhaps more from the sort of the seafood sector, with traceability in terms of the quality of that product. We really are seeing some of that coming through now, and perhaps that might support farmers in the future as well. So hopefully that's given you some sort of introduction to what PLF is, the sorts of sensors that are available in the systems, and also how we're trying to optimize those in order to make them usable by farmers and practical in order to ensure sustainability for future livestock production systems. So thank you very, very much indeed for listening. And as I say, if you do want to get in touch, that is my email address there. And I'm happy to take any questions or to try and answer some of the questions that have come through already.